What if a child could make the final decision between two warring parents? That was the question burning in the back of everyone's mind the moment Ethan stood up in the courtroom with a folded piece of notebook paper in his hand. The sound of his sneakers brushing against the carpet broke the silence that had settled in like a heavy fog. He was only 9, but in that instant, he looked older than any child should have to be. The judge, Honorable Mary Clayton, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, looked down from the bench, her brows knitting together. "Mr. Miller," she said, addressing me, "your son is not on the witness list. He can't testify." "I know," I replied quietly, "but he's not here to testify. He just wants to read something. 1 minute. That's all I'm asking." Across the courtroom, Rachel let out a soft scoff. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. I could see the tension in her jaw, the way she turned slightly toward her lawyer and whispered something under her breath. She thought this was another one of my last-minute stunts. Maybe it was. But for once, this wasn't about me. This wasn't about winning. It was about Ethan. Judge Clayton looked at Ethan again. Her eyes softened, just a little. "Come forward," she said. Ethan nodded, gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stepped forward slowly, walking past the benches and tables until he stood in front of the judge's bench, just a few feet from Rachel and me. He cleared his throat. The entire room leaned in. "My name is Ethan Miller," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "I know I'm not supposed to decide where I live. Grown-ups are supposed to decide that. But I wrote something I want you to hear." Judge Clayton didn't stop him. Ethan unfolded the paper carefully, like it might rip if he moved too fast. I couldn't help but glance at Rachel. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes locked on our son, but there was a flicker, just a flicker of something behind the tension. "Worry? Regret?" Ethan began to read. "Dear Judge Clayton," he said, "I know my parents love me. They tell me all the time. But when they fight, I feel like I don't exist. Like I'm just something they pass back and forth. I don't want to pick between them. I love them both. But when I'm with my mom, she's always busy. She says she wants the best for me, and I believe her. But sometimes, I just want her to listen." I heard Rachel's breath catch, just barely. Ethan continued. "And when I'm with my dad, he doesn't always know what he's doing. He burns pancakes. He forgets where I put my soccer shoes. But he asks me how I'm feeling. And he waits for the answer. And even when I say something dumb, he acts like it matters." He looked up for a moment, right at me. My throat tightened. "I don't want anyone to win," Ethan said. "I just want to feel safe. And happy. And not scared about who I'm going to disappoint." He looked back down at the letter. "So please, don't decide this like a math problem. Don't pick who's richer or who has a nicer house. Pick who makes me feel like I matter. That's all I care about." He folded the letter again. Silence. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Clayton cleared her throat. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "You may return to your seat." Ethan walked back slowly and sat beside me. I rested a hand gently on his shoulder. He leaned into me, just slightly. Rachel didn't look at either of us. Judge Clayton looked over her glasses at the room. "I'm calling for a recess," she said. "We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like thunder. As we stepped into the hallway, the hum of whispered voices surrounded us. People avoided eye contact. Some nodded politely. Others just stared. Rachel walked past us without a word, her lawyer trailing behind her. I crouched down in front of Ethan. "Hey," I said. "You didn't have to do that, you know." He shrugged. "I wanted to. That took guts." He didn't answer right away. Then he looked up at me. Was it enough? I didn't know what to say. I honestly didn't know if it was. But I smiled. It was everything. He nodded. Then, like the 9-year-old he still was, he asked, "Can we get a donut later?" I laughed. "Yeah, buddy. We'll get to. And just like that, the courtroom drama faded into the background. For one brief moment, we were just father and son again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? If you'd asked me 10 years ago whether I ever wanted kids, I would have laughed. Not a bitter laugh, just that dry, you must be kidding kind of laugh you give when someone suggests something that doesn't even compute. I was 25, fresh out of grad school, knee-deep in software development and startup hustle. My life was a steady rotation of caffeine, code, and 3 a.m. pizza. I'd tell people, I'm married to my work. And at the time, I believed that was enough. Then came Rachel. We met at a friend's birthday party in Boulder, one of those rooftop things where everyone pretends they're cooler than they are. I was the guy in the corner with a beer, scrolling through bug reports. She was the girl everyone noticed. Confident, smart, sharp as hell. She called me out for checking GitHub in the middle of a party. I liked her immediately. Rachel was studying for the bar exam. She had this laser-focus energy that both terrified and fascinated me. We started dating a few weeks later, and suddenly my world shifted from code to courtrooms, or at least listening to her rants about how civil law made zero sense. 6 months later, we moved in together. A year after that, we got married. Looking back, I don't think either of us really knew what we were doing. We loved each other, but we were also in love with the idea of building a future, something solid, something adult. But the thing about building a life with someone is, if you don't know yourself, you're building on sand. The first time Rachel brought up kids, we were having dinner on the patio, summer wind in our faces, half a bottle of Pinot between us. I think I want to be a mom someday, she said, just like that. Calm, confident, like it was just another career move. I froze. I probably should have said something honest then. Like, I don't see that for myself. But instead, I smiled and nodded and said something like, yeah, someday. Someday came a lot sooner than expected. Rachel found out she was pregnant 11 months after our wedding. I still remember her holding the stick in one hand and a bottle of kombucha in the other, staring at me with this mixture of excitement and sheer panic. And me? I blinked. It wasn't that I didn't want the baby, it was that I didn't know how to want him. Or her. I didn't know what it meant to be a dad. My own father left when I was 6. He dropped off the map after the divorce, and the only memories I have of him are the smell of gasoline and a worn leather jacket. So, how was I supposed to be something I never had? Rachel, on the other hand, went full throttle. She read all the books, took all the vitamins, signed up for birth classes and mommy blogs. She built spreadsheets of baby names. I stood on the sidelines, watching, trying to feel excited, but mostly terrified I'd screw it all up. When Ethan was born, I cried harder than I thought I could. Not because I was overwhelmed with joy, but because I had no idea what to do with the tiny, squirming person suddenly dependent on me for everything. The first 6 months were a blur. Rachel was amazing with him, structured, organized, present. I felt like the third wheel in my own house. Every bottle I fumbled, every diaper I put on backward, every time I forgot the pacifier, I felt like I was failing. And the more I pulled away, the more Rachel stepped in. I went back to work early. Long hours, late nights. I told myself I was providing. But the truth? I was hiding. From my kid. From my wife. From my own fear of being inadequate. Eventually, that distance turned into resentment. Rachel started calling me out. Why are you never around? Why won't you just try? I'd snap back. Why does everything have to be perfect with you? It wasn't about diapers anymore. It was about control. About fear. About 2 people trying to parent while barely holding themselves together. We drifted. When Ethan was 2, we tried therapy. Didn't last. When he was 4, we separated. By the time he turned 6, we were officially divorced. Rachel took primary custody. I got every other weekend, 2 weeks in the summer, and the sinking feeling that I had become exactly what I feared, a part-time parent. The guy who shows up for birthdays and soccer games, but never knows the name of the math teacher or the weird smell coming from the backpack. But the thing is, something changed around Ethan's 7th birthday. He started asking deeper questions. He wanted to know what I did at work. He wanted to help me cook, even if it meant the kitchen became a war zone. He asked me if I'd ever been scared. And that question broke me a little. Because I had been scared for years. But now I was tired of being scared. I started showing up. Not just physically, but emotionally. I learned how to braid hair on a YouTube video when Ethan wanted a Viking-style braid after watching How to Train Your Dragon. I asked about his day and actually listened. I stopped trying to be the cool dad and just tried to be his dad. And he noticed. We grew something real in those weekend visits. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't Instagram-worthy. But it was ours. So when Rachel filed for full custody last year, I knew I couldn't just roll over. Not because I wanted to win, but because Ethan deserved more than a ghost dad. He deserved the man I had become. Not the man I used to be. And if that meant going to war in court, so be it. I had spent most of my life running from fatherhood. Now, I was running toward it. You know what no one tells you? That being the strong one gets exhausting. When people look at me, they see a woman with a plan. Rachel Morgan, the composed, driven, always one step ahead attorney. Ivy League grad, partner track, picture-perfect wardrobe, and a damn near flawless win record in litigation. They don't see the late nights with a bottle of wine and a cracked phone screen, replaying voicemails I shouldn't keep. They don't see the guilt I carry, the kind that sinks into your bones after a fight with your 9-year-old that leaves you both in tears. And they definitely don't see how scared I was when I found out I was pregnant with Ethan. That moment in the bathroom, holding the test, heart racing, I didn't feel power or confidence. I felt like I was underwater. I had just made partner at my firm. I had student loans still clinging to my back like an old ghost. David and I were barely past the newlywed phase, and we were already fighting more than laughing. But I wanted to be a mother. I always had. The problem was, I thought wanting it would make me good at it. David froze when I told him I was pregnant. No hug. No smile. Just silence. I told myself he'd warm up to it. That he'd rise to the occasion. That men just take longer to connect. He didn't. While I was nesting, researching car seats, and scheduling prenatal appointments, he was working late and crashing on the couch with a laptop half glowing against his face. I didn't feel supported, I felt invisible. Like I was doing it alone, even before Ethan arrived. But I didn't say that. I swallowed it, smiled through baby showers, wrote thank you cards with my swollen feet propped up on a stack of law books. And when Ethan was born, God, he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs like a siren. He looked up at me and I swore, in that moment, I would give him everything. So I did. I breastfed through clogged ducts and courtroom stress. I rocked him through teething while studying briefs at 3 a.m. I planned his meals, memorized his pediatrician's schedule, and kept a color-coded Google Calendar that could put NASA to shame. I made it my mission to create a life for him that was predictable, stable, full of opportunity. Because if I didn't, who would? David tried, in his way. But he didn't see the cracks forming. He didn't see that the woman he married wasn't invincible. That I was hanging on by threads. That every time I carried Ethan alone into a pediatric appointment or cooked dinner after 12 hours in court, I was dying a little inside from resentment. And when David left, I didn't cry. I poured my energy into control because that's how I survive. I created structure. Ethan had routines, tutors, piano lessons, math games, reading logs. He went to the best schools. Ate organic. Saw a child therapist once a month, just in case. I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was trying to protect him. But kids don't always read intentions. They feel patterns. And the pattern in our house was, be good, Follow the schedule. Don't rock the boat. I could tell Ethan felt it, even if he didn't have the words. Sometimes, after school, he'd drag his feet on the sidewalk, clearly hoping I'd ask how his day went. But I was usually on a call or racing home to reheat dinner. Other times, he'd ask to stay longer at David's, and I'd smile, say of course, and then lie awake that night, wondering if he loved his dad more than me. I never said that out loud, not even to my therapist, because that would mean admitting I wasn't enough. Then, a year ago, Ethan came home with a bruise on his arm. Nothing serious, he'd fallen off a bike while at David's, but when I saw it, I snapped. Not at Ethan. At David. I accused him of negligence, of being careless, of not putting our son first. That night, I opened the custody papers again. And I filed to gain full custody. I told myself it was to protect Ethan. That David's inconsistency was a threat. That Ethan needed structure, not weekends of sugar cereal and video games. But deep down, a darker truth whispered, "You're afraid you're losing him." Because I was. He laughed more with David. He opened up more. He shared more. Even started calling me Rachel, once during a heated argument, something I thought I'd never hear from my own child. So I fought. I brought my full arsenal, documents, timelines, testimonials. I painted a picture in court of a father who meant well but didn't follow through. I emphasized my consistency, my stability, my plan. But now, after that letter, I sat in the corner of the courthouse bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror, wondering when exactly I started competing instead of co-parenting. Ethan's words hit something in me I didn't want to feel. He waits for the answer. Even when I say something dumb, he acts like it matters. That line keeps echoing. Because I realized I stopped listening. I was so focused on protecting Ethan from chaos that I forgot to give him room to feel. I built him a perfect home, but I forgot to fill it with warmth. I gave him boundaries, but maybe I forgot about safety. And love? Maybe I showed it in checklists and perfectly packed lunches when what he needed was my full attention during the quiet, messy, unpredictable moments. I don't know what the judge will decide, but I know this. I want to be a better mother. Not a perfect one. Just better. And that starts with listening, truly listening, to the one voice that matters most, Ethan's. Divorce isn't a thunderstorm. It's not dramatic lightning or wind shaking the windows kind of chaos. It's a slow leak in the ceiling that you ignore too long until the ceiling caves in. The day Rachel and I signed the divorce papers, the sky was stupidly clear. Not a cloud. Sun was high. The kind of weather that makes people say, "What a beautiful day." For me, it felt like I was being buried under the brightness. We didn't scream at each other. No dramatic walkouts, no slamming doors. Just two people sitting across from each other in a dull office that smelled like printer ink and cold coffee, scribbling their signatures on a life unraveling line by line. Rachel wore that navy blazer she always wore to court, strong, clean, composed. Her expression was unreadable, as usual. I had a crumpled dress shirt, barely tucked in, and the stale breath of someone who hadn't eaten all day. We didn't look at each other while we signed. Not even once. The paperwork had been in the works for months. Mediation didn't work. Counseling failed before it even began. I showed up late to half the sessions. She canceled the other half. By the time we got to the divorce attorney's office, everything had already been said in silence. The hardest part? It wasn't losing Rachel. It was agreeing to part-time fatherhood. Joint legal custody, the lawyer had explained. But Rachel gets primary physical custody. Ethan stays with her during the school week, every other weekend with you, and summer visitation, split down the middle. I nodded like I understood. Like it was just another contract. But it felt like signing away pieces of my soul. That first night without Ethan? Silence. No Legos on the carpet. No peanut butter smeared on the counter. No bedtime stories. Just me, a half-finished pizza, and a couch that somehow felt too big and too small at the same time. I walked into his empty room at least 4 times that night, thinking maybe I'd hear his breathing, the soft rustle of sheets. But the bed was perfectly made, like no one had ever lived there at all. The weekends I did have him were a scramble. I tried to plan everything out: museums, ice cream shops, backyard soccer. I wanted every second to feel magical, like I was making up for all the lost time. But kids don't care about magic when their parents live in separate houses. They care about consistency, about being seen. And I wasn't very good at that yet. I remember one weekend, Ethan sat in front of the TV watching Paw Patrol, holding a bag of popcorn in his lap. I was pacing in the kitchen, checking work emails, trying to seem like I had things under control. He called out, "Dad, sit with me." "I will in a sec," but I called back. "Just one episode." I said in a second. And then I looked over and saw his face fall. Not angry, not sad, just quiet disappointment. Like he'd already expected me not to follow through. That moment stuck with me. Because it wasn't the screaming matches that leave marks on a kid, it's the small cuts. The broken promises. The glances you don't return. The phone calls you decline. Paper cuts. Thousands of them. Eventually, those cuts bleed into who they become. Rachel wasn't perfect either. Ethan started showing signs of anxiety, not sleeping through the night, clinging to her leg in the mornings. He once told me, quietly, while we sat in line at a drive-thru, "I don't think Mommy likes when I talk about you." I asked him what he meant. "She gets a look," he said. "Like she's mad at the air." I knew that look. Rachel always had a way of waging war without raising her voice. But I couldn't blame her entirely. I'd given her 1,000 reasons not to trust me as a father. Missed recitals. Forgotten dentist appointments. Late pickups. She thought she was protecting Ethan from chaos. I thought I was giving him space to choose. What we both did, unintentionally, was put him in the middle of a war he never asked for. The divorce made that battlefield official. We had to agree on schooling, but not parenting styles. We had to decide on holidays like we were splitting office supplies. Thanksgiving this year. Christmas the next. Birthdays split down the middle, no parties together. Ethan became a calendar item. And every time he had to pack his overnight bag, I could see the question in his eyes. Why can't we just all live in one place again? I didn't have an answer for him. Maybe there wasn't one. The truth is, by the time a marriage ends, the cracks aren't reparable. Trust isn't just broken, it's turned to dust. Rachel and I didn't yell because we didn't have energy left to scream. All we had left was exhaustion, legal jargon, and the quiet ache of two people who once believed love would be enough. But love wasn't enough. Not when communication fails. Not when resentment builds. Not when fear leads. I kept telling myself, at least he'll be okay. Kids are resilient. But that's a lazy lie adults tell themselves so they can sleep at night. The truth? Kids absorb everything. And one day, they write letters in courtrooms. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with being a weekend dad. It's not just about the empty house on school nights. It's not just the half-used box of cereal going stale on the counter. It's the little things like realizing you have no idea what your kid's backpack smells like after a day at school. Or which stuffed animal he clutches when he's had a bad dream. You become peripheral. Important, but optional. At least, that's how it felt in the beginning. The court had laid out our parenting schedule with cold precision. I picked up Ethan from Rachel's on Fridays at 6 p.m. sharp. Dropped him off by Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp. No gray areas. No room for flexibility. Like some sort of emotional rental agreement. Every other weekend. That phrase started to feel like a sentence. At first, I tried to overcompensate. I planned out every minute. We hit the aquarium, the trampoline park, the arcade. I even tried baking, burned an entire tray of sugar cookies because I didn't know you had to soften butter first. I thought if I could cram every ounce of joy into 48 hours, Ethan would never feel the gap. But kids are smarter than that. One weekend, he asked me if we could just stay home. I offered a movie, or bowling, or a new Lego set. But he shook his head and said, "Can we just do nothing for once?" like we would if I lived here. That hit different. Because in trying to be the fun dad, I'd accidentally become the temporary dad. Like a vacation buddy, not a real, present figure in his life. He didn't need fireworks. He needed routine, familiarity, something that felt like home, even if it was only 2 days a week. So I started shifting. I stopped trying to prove I was cool. I leaned into being there. We cooked dinner together, badly at first. He laughed every time I fumbled the can opener or forgot to drain the pasta water. We built a fort that stayed up for 3 weekends in a row and slowly morphed into a reading corner. I started making him lunches on Sunday before drop-off, even though Rachel always packed his school ones. I just wanted him to have a little something that carried me into his week. But the hardest part? Drop-off. There was a quiet wait in those moments, handing over his bag, giving him a hug he always made too quick, and watching him walk away like it was nothing. Like he hadn't just spent 2 days building Lego spaceships with me, laughing so hard he snorted juice out his nose. I never cried in front of him, but I did once, in the car, just a block away. It wasn't just sadness, it was guilt. Deep, aching guilt. Like I had somehow failed by not fighting harder earlier. Like I had abandoned him, even if unintentionally. Like no matter how much I tried now, I'd always be playing catch-up in a race I started late. And the world doesn't exactly support dads like me. The school still called Rachel first. The pediatrician sent updates to her email, not mine. Teachers assumed I was the backup parent. Once, at a parent-teacher conference, Ethan's teacher said, "Oh, you came too," like I was a surprise guest instead of, his dad. It stung. But I never blamed Rachel, not directly. I knew she didn't mean to box me out. She was just used to being the default. She'd carried the mental load for years. It became habit. Still, it made me fight harder. I started asking more questions. I got the school to add me to the contact list. I downloaded every app Ethan used for assignments and learning. I emailed his math teacher just to introduce myself. I offered to split dentist appointments and doctor visits. Rachel didn't always agree, but I kept showing up. Not because I wanted control, but because I wanted Ethan to know he wasn't alone in either house. And the truth is, weekend dads do hurt too. But we don't always say it, because we think if we complain, we're being selfish, or weak, or ungrateful for the time we do get. But silence doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you lonelier. I started writing Ethan letters, just short ones. I'd leave them tucked into his backpack or slid between the pages of his comic books. Things like, "I'm proud of you," or, "That soccer goal was epic." Once I wrote, "Even when you're not here, you're with me." He never said much about them. But once, I saw he had one folded up in his pencil box at school. And that was enough. What I realized over time was this. Being a father isn't about quantity of time. It's about quality of presence. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't rewind to the newborn years or undo all the times I pulled away. But I could show up now, consistently, honestly, without the bells and whistles. Just me and all my imperfect love. I was no longer trying to be the perfect dad. I was just trying to be his dad. And that I was finally getting right. The first time I saw the envelope, I thought it was a mistake. A thick packet, hand-delivered to my apartment by a process server who didn't even make eye contact. Just handed me the envelope, muttered, "You've been served," and walked off like he was delivering pizza. Inside, a formal petition for full custody. Rachel was fighting for sole physical and legal custody of Ethan. My stomach sank. Even though I'd seen it coming, even though the tension had been building for months, the late-night emails, the snippy drop-offs, the tight-lipped communication, it still hit like a punch to the chest. Cold, sudden, brutal, and personal. Because that's the thing about custody battles. No matter how civil they pretend to be on paper, they're never really about logistics. They're about blame, about fear, about control. And maybe, if you dig deep enough, about heartbreak. I called my lawyer the next morning. Jen Abrams. Sharp, seasoned, expensive. She got right to the point. "This is going to get ugly," she said. "Rachel's lawyer is aggressive. They're going for the narrative that you're inconsistent, unreliable, and emotionally unavailable." "Is that all true?" I asked, not entirely joking. Jen gave me a look. "What matters is what you can prove otherwise." So I started digging. Emails, texts, photos, screenshots of video calls, receipts from weekend outings, school newsletters where I was listed as a volunteer chaperone, even though I only lasted half a field trip before getting a migraine from 43rd graders yelling about squirrels. Everything was suddenly evidence. My parenting became a paper trail. I remember one night, staying up past midnight compiling a timeline of every weekend I'd had Ethan over the past year. I color-coded it, cross-checked it with my calendar. Every movie ticket, every doctor visit, every damn Lego set I'd bought him became part of the strategy. I hated every second of it. It felt clinical, hollow, like I had to prove my love through spreadsheets. Meanwhile, Rachel's side was building their case too. They brought up every time I was late, every forgotten school form, every missed parent-teacher meeting, some of which I honestly had no idea even happened. They painted a picture of a father who meant well but didn't follow through. And I couldn't even say they were completely wrong. But what cut deepest? The affidavit. Rachel's written statement. It was calm, professional, but the subtext was sharp. She said I lacked consistency, that Ethan came back tired and overstimulated after weekends with me, that he didn't do homework, that he once missed a dentist appointment because I forgot to check the online portal. She wrote, "I believe David loves our son, but love alone doesn't make someone a stable parent." It was like she reached into my chest, pulled out everything I feared about myself, and put it in Times New Roman, 12 points font. I sat there in my lawyer's office, reading it, my throat dry, hands clenched. Jen looked at me. "We'll challenge all of this, but you need to be ready. They're not pulling punches." The first hearing was set for a Tuesday morning. Courtrooms are colder than you think, not just in temperature, but in energy. The walls are beige, the chairs too hard, and everyone talks in hushed tones, like they're afraid of waking a ghost. Rachel sat across from me in a charcoal blazer, her lawyer whispering in her ear. She didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. We were no longer two people who once built a crib together. We were legal opponents now. When the judge walked in, everything shifted. Suddenly, this stranger in a black robe had more control over my relationship with my son than I did. We each made our opening statements. Rachel's lawyer painted her as the stable, full-time, organized parent. She'd sacrificed her own promotions to be there for Ethan. She created consistency. She provided structure. She shielded him from instability. Then it was our turn. Jen outlined my growth, my increased involvement, my parenting classes, my requests to split school nights. She showed pictures, me and Ethan playing catch, reading together, making pancakes. I saw the judge glance at one with a faint smile. And then, the hearing ended. No ruling yet. Just a date set for full testimony and cross-examinations. More waiting. More tension. The erosion began after that. Rachel and I couldn't even look each other in the eye during drop-offs. Ethan started picking up on the tension. He grew quieter. Asked fewer questions. His drawings at school changed, from bright blue skies to jagged lines and black clouds. His teacher emailed both of us. Ethan seems distracted and withdrawn. I'm concerned this ongoing case is taking a toll. That was the first time I truly considered the cost, not just to me, not just to Rachel, but to Ethan. We were both so busy trying to win the battle, we'd forgotten who the war was supposed to be for. One night, after dropping him off, I sat in my car for 20 minutes just thinking about how much of this was about control, about proving I wasn't a screw-up, about redeeming myself. But what if that wasn't what Ethan needed? What if he didn't want a dad with a court-ordered calendar and laminated parenting plans? What if he just needed a dad who showed up and stayed present? That night, I wrote him another letter. Hey, bud. I know things are weird right now. Grown up weird. But I just want you to know none of it is your fault. You are loved. You are safe. And I'm proud of you every single day. No matter what a courtroom says, I'm your dad. That's forever. I slid it into his favorite book during the next visit. I didn't know it then, but that letter would plant the seed for the one he'd write later. The one that would change everything. Ethan Morgan was only 9, but he already knew what tension tasted like. It was in the silence during drop-offs. In the clipped thank yous between his parents. In the way his mom's lips pressed together when his dad texted to say he was running late, even by 3 minutes. He noticed everything. He just didn't always know what to do with it. At school, he tried to focus on math. Tried to enjoy lunch with his best friend Liam. Tried to remember the rules to dodgeball and where he last left his library book. But lately, his brain felt like it had too many tabs open. And none of them would close. Every Monday morning was a reset. He had to remember which backpack went with which house. Which sneakers were at Dad's. Whether his lucky water bottle was in Mom's car or sitting under the couch at Dad's place. But the worst part? The whispering. Not from classmates, from grown-ups. He heard them. Teachers talking just outside the door after parent-teacher night. His mom on the phone late at night when she thought he was asleep. His dad muttering this whole thing's messed up under his breath when a weekend visit got cut short. Ethan didn't fully understand the words custody hearing, affidavit, full legal rights, but he understood what they meant. They meant he was in the middle of something he never asked to be in. It started creeping into his sleep. He began waking up from dreams he couldn't explain. Ones where he was standing at the top of a hill and both his parents were calling for him, but in opposite directions. Every time he took a step toward one, the other grew smaller. Eventually, he just stopped moving. And stood there, crying. He didn't tell anyone about those dreams. He didn't want to make things worse. When the school counselor, Ms. Patel, called him in one Thursday, she asked gently, "How are you feeling, Ethan?" "Really feeling." He shrugged. She gave him a sheet of paper with cartoon faces on it. Happy, sad, angry, confused, tired, nervous. She asked him to circle too. He circled tired and confused. "I miss when things were easy," he finally said. "Like, when we all had pizza on Fridays. Even if we weren't talking that much." Ms. Patel nodded. "That makes sense. Change is hard. Especially when adults don't have it figured out either." That was the first time Ethan realized even grown-ups didn't always know what they were doing. That scared him. One Friday evening, back at his dad's place, Ethan sat on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. They were supposed to watch a movie, but his dad was pacing the kitchen, talking on the phone. He used that sharp voice, attorney voice, as Ethan called it. The one that meant the call was serious. Ethan heard his name. Then something about school decisions and parental authority. He muted the TV. His heart thumped harder. Later that night, he didn't eat much dinner. Pushed the peas around on his plate. Dad tried joking around, asked if peas were too green to trust, but Ethan didn't laugh like he usually would. "I don't want you and Mom to fight anymore," he finally said. David froze, fork midair. "Hey, buddy, it's not." "Yes, it is." Ethan's voice cracked. "It's all the time. And it's about me." David looked stricken. Not angry, just broken. Like someone had opened up a hole in his chest. "I know it's about me," Ethan whispered. "You think I don't hear stuff, but I do." There was a long silence. Then his dad did something unexpected. He got up, walked over, and sat beside him. Not as an adult trying to fix something. Just as a dad, hurting too. "You're right," David said quietly. "We've been making this harder on you than we meant to. I'm sorry." Ethan didn't respond. He just leaned into his dad's side, his small shoulder pressed against the flannel shirt. They stayed like that for a long time. No TV. No more words. Just warmth. And maybe that's when Ethan started writing the letter. Not literally, not yet, but in his heart. He began collecting the feelings he couldn't say out loud. The things he wished they understood. Not just who he wanted to live with, but why. The way his dad actually listened, even when Ethan rambled about superhero rankings for 20 straight minutes. The way his mom made his life feel organized and safe, even if it sometimes felt like she couldn't slow down long enough to see him when he was quiet. He loved them both. But he felt split in half. The following week at school, he got assigned a journal entry, write about a time you felt caught between two things. He wrote 2 lines. Sometimes I feel like a rope in tug-of-war. And both sides say they love me. But it still hurts. He didn't turn it in. He ripped it out of the notebook and stuffed it in his desk. Because this wasn't a school assignment anymore. It was the start of something bigger. Rachel hadn't always seen herself as the kind of woman who would fight tooth and nail in a courtroom. She had once believed in compromise, in discussion, in the kind of peaceful co-parenting she read about in parenting blogs and online articles written by therapists with soft smiles and framed degrees. But now she was a woman with folders, emails, evidence. She had a color-coded binder of everything David had forgotten, missed pickups, late homework, unexplained absences. There were notes from Ethan's teachers, screenshots of texts he never answered, and copies of the time Ethan came home without his inhaler because David didn't check the bag before they left. Was it petty? Maybe. But to Rachel, it was proof. Proof that she was the one who showed up. Every time. The hearing was less than a month away, and Rachel had shifted fully into defense mode. Her lawyer, Amanda Lynn, called it smart strategy. Rachel called it survival. You're not just fighting for more time, Amanda had said during one of their meetings. You're fighting for structure. For Ethan's stability. Courts respond to that. Keep showing the judge that you're the constant. Constant. That word echoed in Rachel's head like a mantra. Because if there was one thing Ethan needed, it was predictability. David could be amazing, charming, fun, but he was like a wave. He came in strong, then receded. When things got heavy, he shut down. When Ethan had a meltdown over a forgotten school project, David would crack a joke or distract him with a video game. Rachel didn't want a parent who distracted. She wanted one who showed up when it counted. Still, the guilt clung to her. Quiet and persistent. She wasn't blind. She saw how Ethan looked at his dad when they played together. The uninhibited laugh. The way he relaxed in David's presence. It was real. Rachel could admit that even if she wouldn't say it out loud. But every time she considered backing down, the fear clawed its way back up. Fear that one missed dose of medicine would become something worse. Fear that Ethan would fall behind at school because no one helped with his long division. Fear that David would forget something small, and it would cost them something big. Was that control? Or was that protection? Rachel wasn't sure anymore. The custody case had blurred every line. What used to be a shared parenting plan had become a battlefield. Every request David made now felt like a trap, like giving him 1 inch would cost her everything later. He wanted weeknights now. Said he was ready. But Rachel remembered the night Ethan came home crying because he couldn't finish his math worksheet. David had given him the wrong textbook. Had told him it's not a big deal. Maybe it wasn't. But to a child? To a 9-year-old trying to make sense of divorce? It was. And so Rachel doubled down. She asked for school decision-making to be granted solely to her. She petitioned for holidays to rotate less, suggesting Ethan stay with her for the major ones, for consistency's sake. Amanda backed her. The more you present yourself as the organized, forward-thinking parent, the more favorable this ends. Rachel nodded. But a part of her, one she hadn't let speak in weeks, whispered. Is this still about Ethan, or about winning? That voice scared her. It echoed again during a routine visit to Ethan's school. His teacher, Ms. Dawson, met her at the door with a tight smile. I just wanted to check in, she said, gently. Ethan seems distracted lately. Quieter. Rachel bristled. Is he falling behind? No, not academically, but emotionally, he's withdrawing. I think the custody hearing is weighing on him. Rachel nodded stiffly, arms crossed. Then Ms. Dawson added, he mentioned that he feels like he's not allowed to say good things about his dad in front of you. That he doesn't want to hurt your feelings. Rachel felt her chest tighten. She forced a smile, muttered a thank you, and walked out of the school with her head held high. But that night, when Ethan was brushing his teeth, she sat on the edge of his bed and quietly asked, do you feel like you can talk to me about Dad? Ethan looked at her in the mirror. Hesitated. Sometimes, he said. But sometimes it makes you quiet. Like, mad quiet. Rachel exhaled slowly. It was the kind of truth only a child could deliver, without anger, without judgment. Just honest observation. I'm sorry, she said. I'm working on that. Ethan shrugged. It's okay. I know it's all weird right now. Rachel didn't have the words to fix it. But she hugged him longer than usual that night. And she lay awake for hours afterward, wondering when exactly she'd stopped parenting and started strategizing. She wasn't sure anymore where protection ended and control began. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. This fight, this legal war she was waging so hard, was quietly wounding the one person she swore she'd do anything to protect. 3 weeks. That's how much time was left before the custody hearing. David counted down like a man waiting for judgment. Each day passed like a grain of sand slipping through clenched fists, frustrating, inevitable. The hearing wasn't just a date on the calendar anymore. It was the date. The moment everything would either come together or fall apart. He tried to act normal for Ethan. Pizza nights, soccer in the park, building a cardboard robot for a school project. But the anxiety showed in the cracks, like when he snapped at a barista for getting his order wrong, or when he double-checked Ethan's backpack 3 times before drop-off. It didn't help that Rachel had gone radio silent. No texts unless absolutely necessary. Every interaction was transactional, professional. Like they were colleagues forced to coordinate a work event, not 2 people who had once rocked Ethan to sleep under the same roof. He missed when co-parenting felt like a shared mission. Now it felt like a chess game. Every move calculated. Every sentence a potential exhibit. Even Ethan noticed. One night, after building a Lego set in silence, he asked, if I say I like being here, will it get you in trouble? David stopped mid-brick. Where'd you hear that? He asked gently. No one told me, Ethan said. I just wondered. David set the piece down and pulled his son into his side. You don't ever have to pick sides, buddy. You love both your parents. That's how it should be. Ethan nodded, but didn't look convinced. Meanwhile, Rachel was in full-on preparation mode. Amanda had scheduled mock questioning. Rachel spent her evenings rehearsing responses like it was a job interview. What makes you the more consistent parent? Describe how you manage Ethan's emotional needs. How would you foster a relationship with the other parent if given full custody? The last one was always the hardest. Because Rachel wasn't sure anymore if she could foster anything with David. Too much resentment. Too much history. And underneath it all, too much pain she hadn't named yet. Still, she rehearsed. Polished her statements. Reworded anything that might come off too bitter. Amanda was clear. You need to appear firm, but reasonable. Protective, but not possessive. Rachel walked that tightrope daily. And Ethan? He felt it all. He didn't understand court procedures, but he could read people. He could see how his mom triple-checked her planner and how his dad had started waking up early just to sit quietly at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. He asked fewer questions now. Smiled less. But he was watching. Always. At school, he kept doodling the same image in the corner of his notebooks, a house with 2 doors. One marked mom's, one marked dad's. In the middle, a little stick figure version of himself, arms outstretched, unsure which way to turn. His teacher noticed. During Parent Communication Week, she sent a message to both parents. I'd like to gently suggest Ethan be excused from any direct conversations or references to the hearing until it's over. He's clearly absorbing more than he can process, and it's starting to reflect in his behavior." That email hit them both like a slap. David reread it twice before forwarding it to his lawyer. Rachel sat alone at her kitchen table and cried. Not angry tears. Not even frustrated ones. Just exhausted. This fight had gone on for months. And for what? To protect Ethan? To prove something to each other? Or to fill the silence that had grown between them since the day they signed the divorce papers and pretended that dividing a marriage meant dividing the pain? Lines had been drawn. Too deep. Too far. At the final pre-hearing mediation session, things reached a tipping point. The mediator, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes and a clipboard, looked between them and asked calmly, "Before this proceeds to court, is there any willingness to compromise on custody structure?" Rachel looked at David. David looked at Rachel. No words. Not even a nod. Just silence that said we're too far gone. The mediator sighed. "Then I'll see you both in court." As they gathered their papers, Rachel accidentally brushed David's arm. He flinched just slightly. Not because of her, but because of what she represented now, the fight. As they exited the building, David finally broke the silence. "I don't hate you, you know." Rachel stopped. Turned. "I don't hate you either." There was a pause, long, heavy. "I think we both just got lost," she added. "Somewhere between protecting him and proving ourselves." David nodded. "Yeah, and now we're dragging him through it." They stood like that for a moment. Two parents, no longer married, barely co-parenting, but still tethered to each other by a little boy who deserved better. Neither apologized. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, they saw each other. And that mattered. Even if only a little. The courtroom was cold. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Sterile, impersonal, like a place built for judgment rather than justice. It was as if the very walls were waiting to see who would crumble first. Rachel had never been so nervous in her life. Her palms were clammy as she adjusted the papers in front of her, organizing and reorganizing them for the umpteenth time. Her lawyer, Amanda, sat beside her, exuding calm confidence as if this was just another day at the office. But for Rachel, this was the biggest battle of her life. The judge entered, and the room went silent. Judge Garcia was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, her hair tied back into a tight bun, her glasses perched firmly on her nose as she took her seat. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. This wasn't about niceties, it was about facts. About proving who could provide Ethan with the best future. "Mr. Morgan." "Ms. Freeman," Judge Garcia said, her voice crisp and commanding. "This is it. The final day. Let's make it count." David sat across from Rachel, his eyes locked on the judge. He looked composed on the outside, but Rachel could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. He had the same look on his face as he did when he used to work through a tough project, determined, focused, but slightly terrified. The first to speak was Rachel's lawyer, Amanda. She stood, her voice calm but firm as she began her opening statement. "Your Honor, we are here today to discuss the future of a young boy, Ethan Morgan. My client, Ms. Rachel Freeman, has been the primary caregiver for Ethan since birth. She has provided him with the structure, consistency, and love he needs. We are seeking primary custody because we believe that, despite Mr. Morgan's many positive qualities, Ms. Freeman is the parent best suited to meet Ethan's emotional and physical needs." Rachel's heart raced as Amanda spoke. She hadn't expected anything less. She had prepared for this. She knew that Rachel was the more stable, consistent parent. But even as she listened to Amanda's words, something shifted inside of her. A nagging voice whispered that this fight had become something more than just about who was the better parent. This was about winning. About proving something that might not even matter in the long run. When it was David's turn, he stood and cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he spoke to the judge. "Your Honor, I don't doubt that Rachel loves Ethan, David began. But I believe that Ethan's relationship with me is just as important. I've been there for him during tough times, taking him to his sports practices, helping him with his homework, and showing up when it mattered. I know that I'm capable of providing him with a loving and stable environment. What I'm asking for is a fair chance to be an equal part of his life. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she listened to him. She couldn't deny that David had always been a great father when he wanted to be. But she also knew that he wasn't as consistent as she was. He hadn't been there during the nights when Ethan couldn't sleep or when he came home after a tough day at school, overwhelmed by emotions he didn't know how to process. Those moments had been her job, and Rachel had done it because she loved him. The courtroom proceedings continued, with both sides presenting their cases, one witness after another called to the stand. Rachel's heart clenched as Ethan's teachers, friends, and even some of her family members gave testimonies about the stability she had offered. Each word felt like a validation of her efforts, but also a reminder that this wasn't just about her. It was about Ethan. And that was what hurt the most. David's side was no less compelling. He had his own set of witnesses. Friends who spoke about how devoted he was to Ethan, about how he had always been there for him, even when things were tough. Rachel could see the look in his eyes when he talked about their son, the love and concern he had for Ethan's well-being. And yet, despite everything, Rachel still felt like there was a gap. Something missing. A part of Ethan's life that neither of them was truly capturing. He wasn't just a child in the middle of their fight, he was their son. And no matter what happened in this courtroom, the truth was that neither of them could provide him with everything he needed. Not alone. When the judge called for a short recess, Rachel found herself alone in the hallway. The weight of the day was starting to hit her, the exhaustion both mental and physical. She had been so focused on the battle that she hadn't really stopped to think about what this would mean for Ethan in the long run. Even if she won, what would that victory mean? Was this what was best for him? She stepped outside, needing air, needing clarity. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the cool breeze. Her mind was a mess of thoughts, doubts, and fears. She felt the tightness in her chest again, the kind that came when she realized that, no matter what, she was never going to fully win this. She would always be the parent who fought for custody, who argued over who had the better chance of offering stability. But in the end, she would always have to share Ethan with David. Mom? Rachel turned around to see Ethan standing at the door of the courthouse, his little figure small against the imposing building. She hadn't even realized he was there. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her voice catching. "I just wanted to say I'm okay," Ethan said, his voice steady but uncertain. "I'm not scared. You both love me. I don't want you to fight anymore." Rachel knelt down to his level, her heart breaking. She wanted to scoop him up, to tell him that everything was going to be okay. But she knew she couldn't promise him that. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his eyes full of understanding beyond his years. "I love you too." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The evening after the court recess was when it happened. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes glued to the documents she had to review for the next round of the hearing. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing second, and the weight of everything, her fear, the fight, the anxiety, felt unbearable. Even her cup of coffee had gone cold beside her. Ethan had been unusually quiet since they got home from the courthouse. She assumed it was because of the long day, the confusing emotions swirling around him. After all, this was his life they were fighting for. But when she went to check on him before bed, she found him sitting cross-legged on his bed, his back to the door, scribbling something furiously in his notebook. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, stepping into the room. Everything okay? Ethan jumped slightly, startled by the sound of her voice. He turned, his wide eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at her with that quiet, contemplative expression he'd had ever since the custody battle began. Yeah, he finally muttered, looking back down at the paper in front of him. Rachel could see the edge of a folded sheet peeking from his notebook. She felt a pang of concern, but didn't want to push him too hard. She sat down beside him on the bed, trying to keep her voice light. "What are you writing, sweetie?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he hesitated, chewing on the end of his pencil. Then, quietly, he passed her the folded piece of paper. It was handwritten. Small, neat letters filled the page, and as Rachel unfolded it, she felt a lump form in her throat. The letter read, "Dear Mom and Dad, I know things are kind of crazy right now, and it feels like everyone is fighting. But I want you both to know that I'm okay. I'm not mad at either of you. I just want things to go back to the way they were before, when we all could just have fun together without worrying about what happens next. I love you both so much, and I don't want to choose between you. I don't want to be the reason you fight anymore. I just want to feel safe and happy. Please, can we just stop fighting? Love. Ethan." Rachel's breath hitched as she finished reading. The words echoed in her mind, each sentence more heartbreaking than the last. Ethan, their son, had put into words what neither she nor David had been able to articulate. The weight of their battle was crushing him. She felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at Ethan. His face was downcast, his hands twisting together in his lap, clearly waiting for her reaction. "Oh, Ethan," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan looked up, his expression wary. "I didn't want to make you upset. I just thought it might help. I don't want you to be sad." Rachel reached out and pulled him into her arms, her heart aching as she kissed the top of his head. "You're not making me upset, sweetie. You're making me realize something really important." Ethan stayed quiet in her arms, the weight of the letter sinking in for Rachel. She could feel his small body against hers, as though he was trying to make himself as small as possible, wishing he could hide from the storm that had raged around him for so long. Rachel hugged him tighter. Her thoughts swirled, but one thing was clear: she couldn't keep fighting like this. Ethan didn't deserve to be the collateral damage in her and David's struggle for power. The battle over custody was supposed to be about him, but somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten what was truly important. She wiped away a tear and pulled back to look at her son. "I promise you, Ethan, we'll figure this out. We'll make things right, I swear." Ethan nodded, but Rachel could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was too young for this. Too young to be caught in the middle of their adult struggles. And as much as she hated to admit it, she realized that she had been part of the problem. As Rachel sat there with Ethan, a strange sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving who was the better parent. It was about what Ethan needed. What they needed as a family. She kissed his forehead again and stood up. "I'll be right back. I need to talk to your dad." Downstairs, Rachel found David sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. His posture was slumped, his face tired. He hadn't been the same since the hearing began, and Rachel knew he felt the weight of everything just as much as she did. She cleared her throat, standing in the doorway to the living room. "David." He turned to her, his eyes hardening slightly, as if he expected another argument. But when he saw her expression, his eyes softened. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Rachel hesitated for a moment before walking over to sit beside him. She didn't know where to start, but she knew this conversation couldn't wait. "I read Ethan's letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think we've been doing it all wrong." David's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might defend himself or argue. But instead, he just sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said softly. "I've been thinking the same thing." Rachel blinked, surprised by his response. "You have?" David nodded, his gaze distant. I know this isn't what he wants, but I don't know how to fix it. Rachel felt a twinge of hope at his words. Maybe this wasn't a fight they had to win at all. Maybe, for once, they could just listen. Rachel and David hardly spoke to each other during the first few hours after the letter was shared, both too lost in their own thoughts, too stunned by the weight of Ethan's words. But the silence between them didn't last long. There was too much to address, too much unresolved. Rachel hadn't expected David to react the way he did. She had expected defensiveness, anger, or at least some resistance. But instead, he had been quiet, thoughtful. When he came to her after the letter, sitting down beside her on the couch, he had simply said, "We need to talk." The conversation had been hard, raw, even, but it was necessary. Neither of them wanted to be the villain. Neither of them wanted to hurt Ethan. For the first time, they both realized that the custody battle wasn't about them at all. It was about Ethan and what kind of life they were going to help him build moving forward. That realization didn't make the conversation easier, but it gave them both clarity. "We can't keep doing this," Rachel had said, her voice low as they sat across from one another in the living room. "Fighting like this, it's tearing him apart. We're both so focused on winning that we're forgetting what Ethan really needs." David had nodded, though his eyes were full of uncertainty. "I know. I don't want him to be in the middle of this anymore. So, what do we do now?" Rachel had asked, feeling the tightness in her chest, unsure where this path would lead them. David had looked at her for a long time, his jaw set. "I think we need to find a way to make this work, for Ethan's sake. If we have to compromise, we do it." For him, it wasn't an easy decision. Even as Rachel sat at the kitchen table the next morning, the sun coming through the windows in soft rays, she couldn't shake the lingering unease in her chest. Compromise meant letting go of some control, letting go of her vision of how things should go, and trusting David. Could she really do that? But then, she remembered Ethan's face, the way he looked when he handed her the letter. The way his small shoulders had sagged under the weight of a decision that was too big for him to make. Rachel couldn't keep fighting. For him, she had to find a way to stop. That evening, she and David sat down together again. This time, there was no anger, no accusations. Just a shared goal. "Maybe we don't need full custody," Rachel suggested, her voice cautious but determined. "Maybe we can share it. A joint custody agreement. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. I'm willing to work with you, David. I want to find a way where Ethan feels like he's got both of us in his life." David paused, taking in her words. His expression softened. "I don't want to take him away from you, Rachel. I want to be there for him, but I know you've been the one there through everything. I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to replace you." Rachel exhaled deeply, her heart lighter as she listened to his honesty. "I don't think you're trying to replace me, David. And I don't want to replace you either. I just want us to be parents together." The room was quiet for a moment as they both processed the weight of the conversation. Rachel realized, for the first time in a long while, that the bitterness she had felt towards David wasn't helping anyone. She had spent so long focusing on the hurt he had caused her that she hadn't seen the person he had become, someone who wanted to be a part of their son's life. "I think we need to get professional help," Rachel said, her voice steady now. "We've been struggling with communication for so long. Maybe it's time we get some advice. Someone to guide us through this." David's brow furrowed, but then he nodded. "I agree. We can't keep doing this on our own." Rachel smiled slightly, relief flooding her chest. "Then we'll do this together. For Ethan." In the days that followed, Rachel and David worked together to create a shared custody plan that they both could agree on. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, moments when old wounds threatened to resurface. But they kept Ethan in the center of it all. They even agreed to attend co-parenting counseling sessions to help them navigate the road ahead. For the first time, it felt like they were genuinely collaborating, not fighting. They were learning to listen to one another, even if it was hard at times. Their goal was no longer about winning. It was about finding peace. About giving Ethan the stability and love he deserved. One evening, after a particularly long session with the co-parenting counselor, Rachel found herself sitting in the living room with David. They hadn't spoken much after the session. There was still a lot to process, but there was also a strange sense of calm. "You know," Rachel said quietly, "I didn't think we could do this. I thought we were too far gone. That everything was broken beyond repair." David looked over at her, his eyes softening. "Me too. But we're doing it," Rachel said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We're doing it for Ethan. And I think that makes all the difference." David nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "Yeah, I think you're right." Rachel smiled, and in that moment, she realized that their journey wasn't over. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, she could see a future where they both played a role in their son's life, not as adversaries, but as partners in his growth. They were learning to let go of the past and focus on what mattered most. The first meeting with the co-parenting counselor had been a challenge. Rachel and David both walked into the small, sterile office with their own walls still up, unsure of what to expect or whether they'd even be able to make it through the session without clashing. The counselor, a woman named Laura with a calm, soothing presence, had asked them to sit across from each other and share their thoughts on the custody battle. At first, the silence between them had been thick and uncomfortable, but as the conversation unfolded, something began to shift. They were no longer two people at war with one another. Instead, they were two parents, uncertain but willing to try. "I've never felt so disconnected from you, Rachel," David had said quietly, his voice trembling just slightly. "When everything started, it was like I didn't even recognize us anymore. We didn't have a plan. We just fought." Rachel had nodded, her heart heavy. "I know. I never thought we'd end up like this. But I've spent so much time being angry at you that I didn't even stop to think about how Ethan felt in all of this. I've been so focused on winning, on proving a point, that I forgot what was really at stake." Laura had listened carefully, nodding as she guided the conversation forward. It wasn't easy, but after the first session, Rachel and David had agreed to keep trying. They were starting from scratch, learning how to communicate again, how to trust each other, not as partners, but as co-parents. In the days that followed, their relationship slowly began to shift. Rachel and David began communicating more openly, not just about Ethan, but about their own fears and hopes for the future. They began to put their differences aside, acknowledging that their shared goal was to create a stable environment for their son. It wasn't always easy, but they both recognized how important it was. One evening, after a particularly long phone call with the counselor, Rachel sat down at the kitchen table, rubbing her eyes. She'd spent hours reviewing the custody agreement, going over every detail carefully, and while the plan was beginning to take shape, there was still so much uncertainty. She wasn't sure if they could truly make it work. She heard the front door open and a familiar voice called out, "I'm home." David's voice echoed through the house. Rachel took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward the hallway. As she rounded the corner, she saw David standing in the doorway, looking tired but somehow lighter than he had in weeks. "Hey," he said, offering a small, tentative smile. "How was your day?" Rachel returned his smile, though hers was a bit more reserved. "It was all right. Just trying to keep everything together, you know." David nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, I get that. Same here." For a moment, they stood in silence, both of them unsure of what to say next. It was a strange feeling, the quiet, after so much tension. But in the stillness, Rachel realized that there was a sense of peace beginning to form between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking at her. "I've been thinking about the plan, and I think we're on the right track. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to work with you." For Ethan, Rachel's heart swelled with cautious hope. "I feel the same way. I think I think we're finally in a place where we can do this. Where we can really co-parent. David's eyes softened as he stepped forward, his hand lightly resting on her arm. I want to be there for him, Rachel. I want him to have both of us, even if it means compromising on things we both wanted. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew this wasn't easy for David. He had fought for so long, just as she had. But here, now, in this moment, they were both ready to move forward, not as adversaries, but as partners. I don't want him to feel like he has to choose between us, Rachel said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I just want him to know that we both love him and that we're going to figure this out. Together. David nodded, his hand moving to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was small, but it felt like a breakthrough. A tiny step toward healing, toward rediscovering the trust they had once had. We will, he said softly. We will. The next few weeks were filled with small but significant changes. Rachel and David made a concerted effort to put Ethan first, attending counseling together, communicating more openly, and working through their issues, one conversation at a time. They discussed everything from vacation schedules to school events, trying to find common ground on each issue. They also agreed to try to put aside their personal grievances for the sake of their son. For Ethan, the changes were subtle but noticeable. He began to relax again, his laughter filling the house more often than it had in the past. He still had moments where he seemed unsure, but they were fewer and farther between. He was beginning to see that, while his parents might not be together, they were willing to work together for him. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel and David took Ethan to the park, something they hadn't done in months. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly as they watched Ethan run ahead, laughing as he kicked a soccer ball toward them. David looked at Rachel, a soft smile on his face. Remember when we used to come here all the time when he was little? Rachel chuckled. I do. I didn't realize how much I missed this. They stood together, watching their son. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt a sense of hope stirring inside her. It wasn't going to be easy, and they still had a long way to go, but she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. They were learning to trust again, to listen, to compromise. And that was the first step toward healing. The days after that trip to the park passed by in a blur, each one marking another small step toward the future Rachel and David were trying to build for their family. The air was still heavy with the tension of the past, but there was a quiet sense of change in their home. The strained silences had become less frequent, and the conversations were no longer laced with accusations or bitterness. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were beginning to speak to one another as parents, partners in this journey of raising Ethan. Rachel still wasn't sure where this road would take them. The uncertainty lingered in the back of her mind like an unwelcome guest, but she was learning to live with it. Maybe the future didn't have to be mapped out so precisely. Maybe, for once, it was okay to let go of the need for control and trust that things would fall into place. That thought was a revelation. It had been 3 weeks since Rachel and David had started attending counseling together. The sessions were no longer awkward, but rather productive. They were opening up in ways they hadn't done in years. They spoke more honestly now, admitting their fears and mistakes without the weight of the old resentment that had once colored every conversation. One evening, after another co-parenting session, Rachel sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. David was in the living room with Ethan, watching a movie. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was getting late, but her mind was too active to sleep. She had come to realize something important, something she hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. For so long, Rachel had thought that her life had to look a certain way, that she had to stick to a plan, to follow the path that was expected of her. But now, with each passing day, she was learning that life was unpredictable. It was messy, it was difficult, but it was also beautiful in its uncertainty. She no longer had all the answers, and that was okay. She didn't need to control everything. As Rachel sat there, sipping her tea, her phone buzzed. It was a message from David. David. Hey, how are you feeling? Ethan's asleep, and I'm thinking of calling it an early night. You okay? Rachel smiled to herself as she typed a quick reply. Rachel. I'm good. Just thinking a lot. It's all a bit overwhelming, you know? But I'm getting there. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. David. Yeah, I get that. It's been a lot. But I think we're doing better. One day at a time. Rachel paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. One day at a time. It sounded so simple, but in its simplicity, it felt like the key to the peace she was starting to find. She had spent so much time trying to control the situation, trying to fix everything at once. But now, she realized that it was okay to let things unfold naturally, even if it meant not having all the answers right away. Rachel. I agree. One day at a time. She set the phone down and sat back in her chair. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm. The uncertainty of the future didn't seem as daunting anymore. She was learning to let go, to embrace the unknown, and to trust that things would work out. Maybe it wouldn't always be easy, but she could handle it. She had handled it, after all. The next morning, Rachel and David had breakfast together with Ethan. It was a quiet, simple moment, a moment that, in the past, might have felt insignificant. But now, as they sat together at the kitchen table, laughing softly over pancakes, Rachel realized just how much this small moment meant. She was learning to appreciate the little things, the quiet mornings, the shared smiles, the times when they could all just be together without the weight of the past pulling them down. Ethan looked up from his cereal, his mouth full. Hey, Mom. Dad, he said, his voice slightly muffled. Can we go to the park again this weekend? Rachel exchanged a glance with David, both of them smiling. Of course, buddy, David replied. We'll go on Saturday. Ethan beamed, his eyes lighting up with excitement. Yay, he said, nearly knocking over his glass of juice in his enthusiasm. Rachel felt a warmth spread through her chest as she watched her son's excitement. This was what mattered. This was what she had been fighting for all along, not just for custody, not just for legal battles, but for these moments with her son. She wanted him to feel loved, safe, and happy. And right now he was. They were making progress, one day at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel and David continued their work on co-parenting, learning to navigate the new dynamics of their family. There were still moments of tension, moments when old habits threatened to creep back in. But they were different now, stronger, more willing to listen, and more focused on what truly mattered. Rachel had come to accept that her life was not going to look like she had once imagined. She didn't know exactly where the future would take her, but she was learning to embrace the uncertainty. She had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. She had learned to forgive, not just David, but herself as well. One evening, as Rachel tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with a serious expression. Mom, he said, his voice quiet, I'm really glad you and Dad are getting along better now. Rachel's heart caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that, and it made the journey worth it. We're doing our best, buddy, Rachel said softly, brushing a lock of hair away from his forehead. We love you, and that's what matters. Ethan smiled, closing his eyes as he settled into the covers. I know. I'm happy you're both happy. Rachel's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she whispered, Good night, sweetheart. We'll always be here for you. And with that, Rachel left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. As she walked down the hallway, she couldn't help but smile. The future was still uncertain, but she was beginning to feel like maybe, just maybe, they had already taken the first step toward finding peace. Rachel had always believed that forgiveness was a powerful thing. She had read about it, heard others talk about it, and even practiced it to some extent. But forgiving David, the person who had once felt like the enemy, was a different kind of challenge. It wasn't just about moving past a single mistake. It was about letting go of years of resentment, of betrayal, and of unspoken hurts. And most of all, it was about accepting that both of them had played a role in the destruction of their marriage. It was one of the hardest things Rachel had ever done. Yet, with each passing day, she felt herself shedding a little more of the anger and bitterness that had once weighed her down. It had been 2 months since they had started working on their co-parenting relationship, and things were slowly but steadily improving. There were still moments of tension between Rachel and David, especially when it came to making decisions for Ethan, but the overall atmosphere had shifted. They were learning to communicate better, to make compromises, and, most importantly, to prioritize Ethan above all else. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Rachel sat in the living room, flipping through a photo album she hadn't touched in years. It was an old family album, full of pictures from happier times, before the arguments, before the separation. The sight of their wedding day brought a pang to her chest, a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost. She paused on a picture of the three of them at a family picnic. Ethan had been just a toddler, his cheeks rounded with baby fat, his eyes full of wonder. David had been holding him up high, and Rachel had been laughing, her heart light and carefree. Rachel's fingers brushed over the photo. For a moment, she wondered if she would ever feel that carefree again. The years had changed them, both of them. But there was something different now, something that made her believe that they could still heal, that they could still be a family in a new way. David walked into the room, breaking her thoughts. "Hey," he said softly, noticing the photo album in her hands. "Are you okay?" Rachel smiled faintly, closing the album. "Yeah, just thinking about everything." David sat down beside her, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot too. About how everything went down. How I hurt you, and how I hurt Ethan. I'm sorry for all of it." Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart heavy but hopeful. "David, I've been thinking about that too. I know we both made mistakes. But I don't want to keep carrying this anger around. I want to forgive you, and I want you to forgive me." David looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I want that too. I want us to move forward. For Ethan. But also for us, for the kind of relationship we can have as co-parents. I don't want to keep dragging the past behind us." Rachel nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Neither do I. I've been so angry for so long, David. I've been holding on to that anger because I thought it would protect me, but it's just been making everything worse. I don't want to keep doing that." David reached out, gently wiping the tear from her cheek. "I know. And I'm sorry for all the hurt I caused. I never wanted to make you feel that way. You deserve better." Rachel's heart ached as she looked at him. This was the first time in a long time that she had seen such vulnerability in him, such honesty. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that they could truly move forward. The next morning, Rachel and David sat down to have a conversation about their parenting schedule. It was the first time in months that they hadn't been at odds over something as simple as who would pick Ethan up from school or who would take him to his soccer games. They had come to an understanding, an unspoken agreement, that what mattered now was ensuring Ethan felt loved and supported by both of them, no matter how their lives had changed. David looked at Rachel, his voice steady. "I know we still have a lot to work through, but I think we're getting there. I can see it in Ethan. He's happier, more relaxed. I think he's starting to feel like things are going to be okay." Rachel smiled softly, her heart warming at his words. "I think so too. I just want him to feel safe. To know that no matter what happens, we both love him. And we're both here for him." David nodded. "We are." Later that week, Rachel received a letter in the mail, an envelope addressed to her in Ethan's handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. The letter was short, but it was full of words that left her feeling both surprised and deeply moved. "Dear Mom, I know things have been hard with you and Dad, but I want you to know that I love you both very much. I'm really happy that you two are getting along more. It makes me feel better. I want you both to know that I don't want to pick between you. I just want us all to be happy, even if we don't live in the same house. Thank you for trying. I love you. Ethan. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter. It was everything she had needed to hear, to know that their efforts were having an impact. Ethan didn't want to choose between them. He just wanted to be loved. And they could do that. They could give him that love, no matter how their lives had changed. David walked into the kitchen just as Rachel finished reading the letter. She handed it to him wordlessly, her eyes shining. David read the letter slowly, his expression softening with each word. When he finished, he looked at Rachel, a deep sense of gratitude in his eyes. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we?" he asked quietly. Rachel nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we are." For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward with grace and understanding, and about allowing the future to be shaped by love, not resentment. As she sat beside David, looking at their son's letter, Rachel realized that the healing had already begun. And it was stronger than anything they had ever faced. To be a distant memory now. They had come a long way from the awkward silences and the painful exchanges that had once dominated their conversations. Yet, despite the progress, Rachel knew that true co-parenting didn't come with a map. It was a road they had to navigate together, one step at a time. It had been a few weeks since Rachel had received Ethan's letter, and things felt different. The atmosphere in the house was calmer, more peaceful. They were starting to find their rhythm as co-parents, slowly learning how to work together, not as a married couple, but as two individuals who both loved their son more than anything in the world. There were still moments of discomfort, of course. The new dynamic wasn't always easy. They had to adjust to their new roles, which meant letting go of old expectations and creating new boundaries. But for the most part, Rachel felt that they were getting there. Slowly, but surely. One evening after dinner, Rachel and David found themselves sitting on the couch, flipping through their phones. Ethan had gone to bed, exhausted from a day spent running around with his friends. Rachel couldn't help but notice the quiet ease between them, something that had been absent for so long. David glanced over at her, his voice casual but thoughtful. "I've been thinking. I know it hasn't been perfect, but I'm proud of how far we've come. And I think Ethan is too." Rachel nodded, meeting his gaze. "I am too. It's not easy, but I think we're getting better at this. At being parents, at being friends. I can see it in him. He's more confident, more relaxed. It's like we're starting to find our way." David smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. "It's funny, isn't it? I spent so much time thinking that I had to win, that I had to be the one who came out on top. But now, all I want is for Ethan to feel safe and happy. And for us to be able to work together for his sake." Rachel's heart warmed at his words. There had been a time when she would have never believed David capable of such reflection, of understanding what truly mattered. But time had a way of changing things. And so had their commitment to co-parenting. "It's not easy," Rachel said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not always going to be perfect. We're going to have to keep working at it. But I think we can do this. For Ethan. And for ourselves." David nodded, his eyes softening. "Yeah, I think so too. One step at a time." The weeks went by, and Rachel and David continued to find their way through this new reality. They had become more accustomed to the rhythm of their shared responsibilities, from school drop-offs to soccer games, to late-night discussions about Ethan's future. Though they no longer shared the same home, they had found a way to make it work. They were learning to collaborate, to communicate, and to put their son's needs first. But co-parenting wasn't without its challenges. One evening, Rachel found herself sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing Ethan's schoolwork. There was a note from his teacher, and it wasn't the kind of note any parent wanted to read. It mentioned a recent change in Ethan's behavior. He had been more withdrawn at school, and his grades had begun to slip. Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach as she stared at the note. She had been so focused on her personal journey of healing that she had missed the signs. Ethan hadn't been himself lately. The strain of the past months was starting to catch up with him, and Rachel wasn't sure how to fix it. The next day, she and David met for their weekly co-parenting meeting at a local cafe. They had decided early on that these meetings were essential, a time to check in with each other, discuss Ethan's progress, and make any necessary adjustments to their shared parenting plan. It was a simple routine, but it gave them both the space to talk openly without distractions. When Rachel brought up the note from Ethan's teacher, David's face fell. "I didn't know he was having trouble," he said, running a hand through his hair. "He seemed okay at home, but I guess maybe I missed it too." Rachel sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I think we've both been so caught up in the logistics of co-parenting that we haven't really been paying enough attention to him. We're doing better at working together, but Ethan's been going through a lot, and I think we've neglected that." David looked at her seriously. "You're right. We've been so focused on making sure we're doing this right that we didn't stop to think about how he's feeling about all of it. He's not the same kid he was before." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "He's been through a lot, his parents separating, living in 2 different houses, having to adjust to all these changes. We've been so focused on fixing things between us that we forgot that he needs our support too. Emotionally, he's struggling." David leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "So, what do we do?" "I think we need to talk to him. Sit down and ask him how he's really doing." Rachel felt a sense of relief wash over her. For all the progress they had made, she had been afraid to bring up how Ethan was truly coping. She had been afraid of the answers, of confronting the reality that their son wasn't okay. But now, hearing David say it out loud, she realized that this was the next step they needed to take together. "We'll talk to him," Rachel agreed softly. "But we have to be gentle. He's been through a lot. We don't want to make him feel like he has to choose sides again." David nodded. "I agree. We'll do it together. And we'll keep checking in with him, making sure he knows we're here for him. Always." Later that evening, they both sat down with Ethan on the couch. The conversation was delicate, slow, and gentle, like they were walking through a field of fragile glass. But as they spoke to him, something shifted. Ethan began to open up, speaking quietly about how he missed their old life, how he was struggling to fit in at school, and how he didn't quite understand why things had changed. Rachel and David listened, offering comfort without judgment. They assured him that it wasn't his fault, that everything was going to be okay, and that they were both there for him, no matter what. The conversation didn't fix everything in an instant. But for the first time in a long time, Rachel and David realized that their focus couldn't be solely on their own healing. They needed to heal together as a family, and that meant listening to Ethan's needs as well. That night, as Rachel tucked Ethan into bed, she kissed him on the forehead. "We're always here for you, sweetheart. We'll get through this together." Ethan smiled softly, his eyes a little brighter than they had been in weeks. "I know, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, more than anything," Rachel whispered, her heart swelling with a love so deep it almost hurt. As she left the room, Rachel felt a new sense of hope. They had taken another step forward, not just as co-parents, but as a family. And though the road ahead would have its bumps, Rachel was beginning to believe that they could navigate it together. It was the morning after their heartfelt conversation with Ethan. Rachel had woken up earlier than usual, the weight of everything they had discussed the night before lingering in her thoughts. She had always known that healing wasn't linear, but now, the responsibility of guiding their family through the process felt so much heavier. Co-parenting was hard enough, but learning to rebuild the trust that had been shattered between her and David, that felt like an entirely different challenge. As she made her coffee, Rachel glanced at the clock. Ethan had already left for school, and David had texted that he'd be there shortly to help with some errands they had been putting off. It had become part of their routine now, working together on things like grocery shopping and picking up household supplies. Practical tasks that were far from glamorous, but important in ensuring they stayed aligned in their efforts to create a consistent, stable environment for Ethan. They were both learning that sometimes the most important thing in a relationship wasn't the grand gestures, but the little moments, the day-to-day exchanges that helped them rebuild their connection. When David arrived, they exchanged a quick greeting, but there was something unspoken between them now, a deeper awareness of how much both of them had changed in such a short time. "I've been thinking about the conversation we had with Ethan last night," David said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "We did the right thing by talking to him. But I don't want to let things slip back to how they were. We need to keep communicating, both with each other and with him." Rachel nodded, glancing out the kitchen window for a moment. "I agree. But I think we also need to be honest about the fact that we've both hurt each other. I've carried so much resentment, and I know you have too. But we've got to let that go if we're going to move forward." David's expression softened. "I know. I've been thinking a lot about that too. I spent so much time trying to win, trying to be the one who got the most out of the divorce. But none of that matters anymore. What matters is Ethan and us learning how to be better for him. And for ourselves." Rachel felt a sense of relief in his words. She had heard his apologies before, but this time, there was a clarity in his voice, an openness she hadn't heard in years. They spent the morning running errands together. It wasn't the most exciting way to spend the day, but there was something comforting in their shared tasks. They moved in sync, picking up groceries, deciding on items for the house, even discussing which brand of toilet paper was the best. These small moments, unremarkable to anyone else, felt like victories. They were functioning together, not as two separate people, but as a team. After they finished shopping, David suggested grabbing lunch at a nearby diner, just the two of them. As they sat down with their sandwiches, Rachel took a deep breath. It was time to have another conversation, one that had been weighing on her heart for a while. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative. "We've done a good job so far, but we've only just begun. I know co-parenting isn't easy, and I don't expect us to have all the answers. But I feel like we need to talk about our boundaries, about how we can better support each other in this new role, and not just for Ethan's sake, but for our own well-being, too." David looked at her, taking a moment to process her words. He had always admired Rachel's ability to be direct. It wasn't something he'd ever been good at, especially in the past. But now he saw the value in it. "You're right," he said after a beat. "We've been doing okay, but we haven't really talked about how we navigate this whole thing for ourselves. What happens when one of us needs space, or when there's a disagreement that doesn't directly involve Ethan but still affects the way we interact? I don't want us to just sweep things under the rug anymore." Rachel appreciated his honesty. "Neither do I. I think we've both been holding on to too much. I don't want to be bitter. I want to be able to talk to you openly about how I feel without worrying about starting a fight." David reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. "I want that too. I think we've got a long road ahead of us. But as long as we're both committed to being open and honest, I think we can make it work." Rachel squeezed his hand, a small but significant gesture. "I believe that, too. We don't have to have it all figured out right now. But we need to keep working at it. For Ethan. For us." The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of effort and patience. There were still moments of tension, times when old habits crept back in, or when misunderstandings threatened to pull them back into old patterns. But every time they stumbled, they picked themselves up again, reminding themselves of what they had learned. That communication, forgiveness, and trust were the foundations of what they were building together. They continued to check in with each other, scheduling regular conversations about how they could be better co-parents and partners in this new chapter. They even began to have moments of lightheartedness again, the kind of moments that had been lost during the darker days of their marriage. It wasn't that everything was perfect, but it was better. They were learning to grow in new ways, separately and together. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Rachel and David sat on the couch together, quietly watching TV. It was a rare moment of stillness in their lives, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt content. It wasn't the kind of happiness she had expected, the kind she had envisioned during their marriage, but it was real. It was the kind of happiness that came from knowing that, despite everything, they were creating something meaningful out of the wreckage. David glanced over at her, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" Rachel nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yeah, I think we are." The next day, they met with Ethan's therapist to discuss his progress. The conversation was encouraging. Ethan had been opening up more at school, and his grades had started to improve. But more than anything, it was clear that he felt more secure. He was beginning to trust that, despite the changes in his life, his parents would always have his back. As Rachel and David left the therapist's office, Rachel looked at him with a sense of gratitude. "I think we're getting somewhere," she said quietly. David smiled, squeezing her hand. "I think so too." For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt that the future was no longer a source of fear. She didn't know exactly what it would hold, but she was ready to face it. Not as the woman who had been hurt and betrayed, but as a mother, a co-parent, and someone who had learned to heal one step at a time. Life had begun to find its rhythm again for Rachel, David, and Ethan, but as much as they had learned and grown together, the road to healing was never going to be linear. With each step forward, a new challenge seemed to arise, testing their resolve and commitment to the new family dynamic they were creating. It was late afternoon when Rachel received the email from Ethan's school. She hadn't expected to hear from them, not so soon after their last meeting with the therapist. But the subject line alone, important, update on Ethan, was enough to make her heart skip a beat. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she clicked it open. The message was brief. It was about Ethan's progress in school, but what caught Rachel's attention wasn't the academic improvement. It was the mention of Ethan's emotional regulation and his occasional withdrawal from classmates. The counselor had recommended that Rachel and David attend another meeting to discuss strategies for supporting Ethan's emotional well-being further. Rachel felt a wave of concern wash over her. Although things were looking up in some areas, Ethan's emotional state was still fragile. After all they had been through, the divorce, the custody battle, and the changes in their living arrangements, it was no surprise that he was still trying to process everything. But hearing that he was still struggling, even in small ways, made Rachel's heart ache. She picked up the phone and dialed David. As it rang, she mentally rehearsed what she was about to say. There was no easy way to explain this to him, not because he wouldn't care, but because she knew how much he wanted Ethan to be okay. They both did. When David picked up, his voice was warm but tired. "Hey, what's up?" "I got an email from Ethan's school," Rachel said, her voice tinged with concern. "It's about his emotional well-being. They want us to meet with the counselor again. It looks like he's still having trouble with how he's handling everything. He's withdrawing more at school, and they want to make sure we're on the right track with supporting him." David was silent for a moment. "I figured it wasn't over yet, but I thought we were making progress." Rachel sighed. "I did too. But there's more to it than I realized. He's been through so much already, and I think we're still trying to adjust to this new normal ourselves." David's voice softened. "Yeah, I get it. We've both been so focused on getting our own lives in order that maybe we didn't see how much he was still carrying. We need to do this." For him, Rachel nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll set up the meeting. We'll go together, like last time. I think it'll help." The meeting with the counselor was scheduled for the following week, and as the day approached, Rachel found herself dreading it. Not because she didn't want to be there for Ethan, but because it was a stark reminder of how far they still had to go. The reality was that they couldn't fix everything in one conversation. But they had to keep trying for Ethan's sake. That was what mattered now. When the day of the meeting arrived, David picked Rachel up and they drove together to the school. Ethan had stayed home that day, feeling tired after a long week. They didn't want to burden him with the weight of another adult conversation, so they had decided to meet without him, hoping they could come up with a plan to support him better. The counselor, a calm woman named Ms. Alvarez, greeted them warmly when they arrived. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, they sat down, and she got straight to the point. Ethan's doing well in some areas, but his emotional well-being still requires attention, Ms. Alvarez began. We've noticed that he tends to pull away from his classmates when he's feeling overwhelmed, and he's had some difficulty regulating his emotions in stressful situations. Rachel and David exchanged glances, both feeling a pang of guilt. They had known their son was struggling emotionally, but hearing it laid out so plainly was a sobering reminder of the depth of his struggles. Ms. Alvarez continued, "It's important to remember that Ethan is processing a lot right now. Divorce, changes in his living arrangements, and the ongoing tension between his parents, all of this can contribute to feelings of insecurity. It's not uncommon for children to withdraw as a coping mechanism." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. "What can we do to help him? We want to be sure we're doing everything we can." "Well, Ms. Alvarez said thoughtfully, "The first step is making sure Ethan feels emotionally safe. Both of you have been doing well by keeping the lines of communication open with him, but we need to continue fostering an environment where he feels supported. Encouraging open conversations, allowing him space to express his feelings without judgment, and reinforcing that his emotions are valid are all critical. And you two working together as co-parents is a big part of that." David nodded slowly. "We've been trying to communicate more, to keep things calm for Ethan. But I feel like we're still finding our way." "That's perfectly normal," Ms. Alvarez reassured them. "It takes time, but you're on the right track. Keep showing up for him consistently. That's what will help him the most." As they left the meeting, Rachel and David felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had come a long way, but they still had more work to do. Ethan's emotional needs were just as important as his physical needs, and they couldn't afford to let their own discomfort get in the way of giving him the support he deserved. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Rachel and David sat together, their conversation turning toward the next steps. "I feel like we're in this constant cycle of trying to figure it out," Rachel said, her voice a little weary. "I thought we were doing better, but I guess we still have a lot to learn." David's face softened. "We do, but we're getting there. And for what it's worth, I think Ethan can see it. He's been more open lately. We just have to stay consistent, keep showing him that we're here." Rachel nodded, though there was still a heaviness in her heart. She knew they couldn't solve everything overnight, but she also knew they were making progress. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough for now. As they sat together, talking quietly about their next steps, Rachel realized that this was the most important thing. They were no longer in a race to fix everything. They were learning to be patient with themselves, with each other, and with Ethan. And in doing so, they were slowly but surely rebuilding the family they had once lost. The road ahead would be long, but Rachel knew they could make it. As long as they continued to communicate, support each other, and put Ethan's needs first, they had a chance at something new, something better. The following months felt like a series of small but meaningful victories. Each step forward was earned, not handed to them. Rachel and David had learned that healing wasn't an all-at-once process. It was a series of gradual changes that took place when they least expected it. Yet, as much as they were trying to get things right for Ethan, they were starting to realize that some of the habits and patterns from their past were still lingering. These weren't always easy to confront, especially when it came to setting boundaries that would allow them both to heal as individuals and as co-parents. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Rachel and David found themselves sitting in the living room of the house they still shared for Ethan's sake. The arrangement had worked so far. It had allowed them to co-parent with fewer complications and ensured Ethan had a consistent environment to thrive in. But as time passed, the cracks in their co-parenting arrangement were beginning to show. David was on the couch, scrolling through his phone while Rachel sat across from him, flipping through a magazine she'd just bought. There was an underlying tension in the room, one that neither of them could ignore anymore. "I think we need to talk," Rachel said, breaking the silence. She set the magazine down, looking directly at David. "About boundaries. About what we each need, not just for Ethan, but for us." David looked up from his phone, surprised but intrigued. It had been a while since they'd had a deep conversation about their co-parenting dynamic, and he knew it was long overdue. "Okay," he said slowly, putting the phone aside. "What do you have in mind?" Rachel hesitated before speaking. "We've been doing all right. But the truth is, I think we both have areas where we need space. I don't think we've done a good job of setting boundaries, personal ones, for ourselves. We're still kind of mixing everything together." David thought about it for a moment. She wasn't wrong. They'd been so focused on providing stability for Ethan that they hadn't really thought about the emotional toll it was taking on them. Co-parenting was one thing, cohabitating, even for the sake of their son, was another. They had both been sacrificing their personal boundaries to make things work, and while it had served a practical purpose, it wasn't sustainable in the long run. "I get it," David finally said. "We've been walking on eggshells, trying to keep everything as smooth as possible. But we haven't really talked about what we both need. I think we're both scared to push too hard, afraid of disrupting things again." Rachel nodded. "Exactly. And I know it's not easy, especially because Ethan's at the center of everything. But we also need to be okay with having our own space, physically and emotionally. We can't be everything to each other anymore." David's expression softened, a trace of sadness flickering across his face. "I think I've been holding on too much. I've been so used to being involved in every little thing with you and Ethan that I've forgotten how to give myself room. I don't want to go back to the way things were, where we felt suffocated." Rachel sighed, relief flooding her chest. "I'm glad you're saying that, because I feel the same. It's been a fine balance between keeping things comfortable for Ethan, but also keeping our own emotional health intact. I think it's time we sit down and really figure out how we can respect each other's space." David sat back on the couch, running his hands through his hair. "So, what kind of boundaries are we talking about here?" Rachel paused before answering. "For starters, I think we need clear guidelines about when we're handling things together and when we're handling them separately. For instance, when it comes to decisions about Ethan's schedule, extracurriculars, and big choices, we need to be on the same page. But if it's just casual things, like picking up groceries or deciding on what to eat, we should give each other more space to make those decisions without feeling like we need constant input from each other." David's eyes widened slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That sounds reasonable. I think I've been overcompensating by trying to be involved in everything when I could trust you to handle the smaller things without needing me to weigh in every time." Rachel smiled softly, grateful for his openness. "Exactly. And we also need to set emotional boundaries. For example, if we're ever feeling frustrated or upset, we can't keep that inside. It's okay to take a step back and say, 'I need some time,' rather than letting the anger or tension build up." David looked at her thoughtfully. "I've been guilty of that. I've always had a tendency to bottle things up. But I don't want to let it fester, especially with you. I can see how important it is to just talk things out, instead of letting it build until it becomes a problem." Rachel reached for his hand, her voice softening. "And I need to be better about not letting old habits take over. I don't want us to fall back into patterns that don't work for either of us. We've come too far for that." David squeezed her hand in return. "I think we've both learned a lot, and we've got to keep pushing through the growing pains. The changes we've made, they're real. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. We've got to stay focused on what matters, the healthy future we're trying to build for Ethan." Rachel nodded, the weight of their conversation settling in. "Yeah, And for ourselves too. We need to remember that we're not just co-parents. We're individuals who are figuring out how to make this work, one day at a time. The conversation left them both with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they weren't perfect, but for the first time, they felt confident that they were on the right path. Setting boundaries, both physical and emotional, was an ongoing process. They would have to revisit the conversation many more times in the future, but that was okay. As long as they kept talking, kept adjusting, they could keep growing together. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and David made a conscious effort to respect each other's space. They kept their co-parenting partnership strong, but they also recognized the importance of their own identities outside of that role. Rachel started taking time for herself, long walks in the park, quiet evenings reading, and reconnecting with friends she hadn't seen much of since the divorce. David, on the other hand, began to carve out time to focus on his own interests, like painting and attending a book club that had been a long-forgotten hobby. And as they worked through the growing pains of their new dynamic, they continued to check in with Ethan. His progress was slow, but it was steady. He was learning how to express his feelings more, and Rachel and David were learning how to listen without judgment. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were finally getting it right. As the days turned into weeks, Rachel and David found themselves at a crossroads in their relationship. The boundaries they had established were working well, but now a new challenge presented itself: trust. They had spent years building a life together, only to watch it crumble under the weight of broken promises and unspoken fears. Now they were trying to rebuild, but the foundation they needed to create was one built on trust, a delicate and fragile thing that was hard to regain once lost. It was late evening when Rachel sat alone in the kitchen, sipping her tea, her mind running in circles. She had been reflecting on everything they had been through: the custody battle, the pain of their separation, and the long, slow road to healing. Though things had been moving forward, she knew there was something important they hadn't fully addressed yet: trust. In the beginning, they had been partners in every sense of the word. They had shared their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. But when everything fell apart, those shared moments had turned into reminders of the betrayals and the pain. They hadn't just lost their marriage, they had lost the trust that had held them together for so long. Rachel thought about how they had both been so guarded in the months following their separation. Every decision, every conversation had been weighed down by the uncertainty of the future. They had learned to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of co-parenting, but there was still so much unspoken between them. And now, as their relationship began to evolve, Rachel realized that without trust, their attempts to co-parent with understanding and respect would be short-lived. David had been quiet lately, withdrawn in a way that Rachel wasn't used to. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, but she noticed that their conversations had become more functional than emotional. They talked about Ethan's school, their work schedules, and the logistics of their shared parenting arrangement, but that was about it. The connection they had started to rebuild after the intense period of their divorce seemed to be slipping through their fingers. It was a moment of honesty, raw and unguarded, that broke through the silence. The next day, when David arrived to pick up Ethan for his weekend visit, Rachel decided it was time. The weight in her chest had grown unbearable, and she could no longer pretend that things were fine when they weren't. "David, wait a second," Rachel said as he was about to walk out the door with Ethan. He paused and looked back at her, raising an eyebrow. She could see the tiredness in his eyes, the exhaustion from trying to juggle everything: parenting, work, and life, while keeping up the facade that they were perfectly fine. "What's up?" David asked, his voice weary. "I think we need to talk," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "About trust." David's expression shifted slightly. He stepped back into the living room, glancing at Ethan, who was already at the door with his backpack, ready for the weekend visit. "I don't want to have this conversation in front of him," Rachel added quickly, motioning toward Ethan. "Can we sit down after he leaves?" David hesitated, but then nodded. Okay, sure. After Ethan was gone, Rachel and David sat down on the couch, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily between them. The silence was thick, and Rachel could feel the tension creeping into her shoulders. I've been thinking, Rachel began, her voice a little shaky, about how we've been moving forward. I know we've made a lot of progress in the way we're co-parenting, but there's something we haven't really addressed. David waited, his eyes steady but guarded. I think we need to talk about how we rebuild trust, Rachel said, her words coming out more vulnerable than she had intended. I don't want to pretend that everything is fine when we both know it's not. I feel like we've been tiptoeing around this, and it's starting to affect everything, especially when it comes to how we communicate and how we move forward together, for Ethan. David's face softened. I didn't realize it was bothering you that much. Rachel looked down at her hands, gathering her thoughts. It's not just that, David. I think we've both been carrying this weight of mistrust for so long that it's impossible to move past it without talking about it. I don't expect things to be perfect overnight, but I think we need to be honest with each other about where we are and what we need. David leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet. I get it. You're right. It's been a lot. I've been holding back, too. I don't know if it's fear or what. I guess I didn't want to make things worse. But I see now that avoiding the problem only makes it worse. Rachel nodded, her heart racing. We've both been afraid. And I don't want to keep living like that. I don't want to feel like we're still walking on eggshells around each other. We need to be able to trust each other again. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. I'm scared, too. I've spent so much time second-guessing everything I do around you, worrying about what you think or if I'm doing something wrong for Ethan. I guess I never really allowed myself to trust you again after everything that happened. Rachel's voice softened. And I haven't made it easy, have I? I've held on to so much resentment and anger, and I've kept it inside, even though I know it only makes things harder. I didn't want to trust you again, because I thought it would mean I'd be letting go of the hurt. David reached out and gently touched her arm. I've been holding onto my own hurt, too. I think we've both been afraid to really let go of the past. Rachel looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. But we have to, don't we? For Ethan. For us. David's voice was thick with emotion. Yeah, we do. They sat there for a moment, their gazes locked, both understanding the depth of what they were saying. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But there was something powerful about admitting their fears and their mistakes, and even more so, acknowledging their mutual desire to rebuild what they once had. It was the first step toward healing. Later that night, as Rachel lay in bed, she felt a sense of quiet peace settle over her. They hadn't solved everything, but they had broken down the walls that had been keeping them apart. They had taken the first step toward rediscovering the trust that had once anchored their relationship. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt hopeful. There was still so much to work through, but they were finally, truly, moving forward. The days following Rachel and David's heart-to-heart conversation felt like the beginning of something new. Something raw, vulnerable, and necessary. But they also understood that rebuilding trust wasn't a destination, it was a journey that would take time. There would be missteps, uncomfortable moments, and inevitable setbacks. Yet, despite all that, both of them were committed to taking it one day at a time. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon when David arrived to pick up Ethan for his weekend visit. He stood at the door for a moment, hesitating before knocking. It wasn't that he was nervous, but he was still feeling the weight of the conversation they had had about trust. It wasn't something that could be fixed with just words, it was something that had to be lived. Rachel had been incredibly open with him, and now it was his turn to prove he was willing to do the same. When Rachel answered the door, she greeted him with a warm smile, one that he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a sign that they were both trying, making progress in their own way. "Hey," Rachel said, her voice steady yet gentle. "Ethan's upstairs, getting his bag. He's excited to spend the weekend with you. David smiled. I'm looking forward to it, too. They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence between them. The tension had lifted somewhat, but there was still an unspoken understanding that they were navigating uncharted waters. They had talked about trust, but now they had to show it in action. As Ethan bounded down the stairs, ready for the weekend, Rachel couldn't help but notice how different things felt. There was a lightness in the air, a feeling that things were shifting. Maybe it was the trust they were rebuilding, or maybe it was the fact that they were both committed to putting their son's well-being first. Either way, Rachel was determined to remain hopeful. Have a good weekend, buddy, Rachel said as she gave Ethan a hug. Be good for Dad, okay? Ethan nodded enthusiastically. I will, Mom. I'll miss you, but I'll be back soon. David smiled, the affection between them palpable. We'll make sure to bring you back in one piece. As Ethan hopped into the car with David, Rachel stood on the porch, watching them drive away. It was moments like these that reminded her of why she and David had been a team in the first place. There had been love, there had been laughter, and there had been dreams of a future together. Now, those dreams had shifted, no longer about them as a couple, but about their shared commitment to Ethan. Later that night, after the house had quieted down and Rachel had taken some time for herself, she sat down to reflect. She was beginning to see the fruits of their efforts, small but significant changes. The walls between them weren't completely down yet, but the cracks were starting to show, and that was a good sign. Rachel remembered a moment earlier in the day when she had received a text from David. It was simple, just a reminder about a school event Ethan had coming up, but it was something that signaled progress. It wasn't an emergency, and it wasn't a message that needed an immediate response. But it was thoughtful, and it reminded Rachel that they were communicating without tension. That, in itself, was a small victory. David, too, was feeling the shift. It had been a long time since he had felt like he was in control of his emotions and his actions, especially when it came to Rachel. For so long, he had been either pushing too hard or pulling away, never quite finding a middle ground. But now he was learning to trust again. Not just Rachel, but himself, too. As he drove Ethan to their weekend destination, he reflected on the changes he had been making. The road to healing wasn't easy, but David realized that it was necessary for his own growth. If he didn't work on rebuilding trust with Rachel, it would be impossible for them to co-parent effectively. They needed to be able to communicate openly and honestly, and that meant breaking down the emotional barriers they had both been hiding behind for so long. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about them, too. They were parents, yes, but they were also individuals who had their own healing to do. And as David sat at the stoplight, he made a promise to himself to not let fear or resentment dictate his actions. He would be patient, take things one step at a time, and let trust grow organically. As the weekend passed, both Rachel and David focused on their own personal growth. Rachel spent time with friends she hadn't seen in months, reconnecting with her own sense of identity. She took long walks, read books, and spent time in quiet reflection. She didn't feel guilty for enjoying moments of solitude anymore. In fact, she welcomed it. David, on the other hand, spent time revisiting hobbies he had long neglected. He took up painting again, something he used to love before the chaos of their marriage and the divorce had consumed his time. It was a small act, but it was an important one, an act of reclaiming himself and his passions. When Ethan came home that Sunday, David felt refreshed, ready to face the challenges ahead. That night, when Ethan was settled in bed and David was about to leave for the evening, he paused before heading out the door. "Hey," David said, turning back to Rachel. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate you. You've been really patient with me. I know we're not where we want to be yet, but I feel like we're getting there." Rachel smiled warmly, touched by his words. "I feel the same way. It's been hard, but I think we're on the right path. We're learning how to trust again, and that means everything." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. We're doing okay. One day at a time. Rachel watched him leave, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. They still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt like they were moving forward, not just for Ethan, but for themselves. It was a bright, crisp morning when Rachel and David stood side by side in the small cafe where they had once shared their first coffee date. Now, years later, they were back, not as a couple, but as parents who had found a new rhythm together. A new beginning. They didn't need to say much, just being there, together, felt like the culmination of everything they had been through. The quiet understanding between them was the proof of their progress. "Remember when we used to come here every weekend?" David asked with a nostalgic smile, glancing around the cafe. Rachel chuckled, her eyes softening as she looked at the familiar surroundings. "I remember. We'd talk for hours, dreaming about our future, about our little family. It feels like a lifetime ago." A lifetime ago, indeed. So much had happened since those carefree days. The court battles, the painful separation, the struggles of single parenthood, and the slow, tentative steps toward healing. They had both learned lessons along the way, lessons about love, forgiveness, and trust. Now, as they sat there sipping coffee, the weight of the past no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it had become a series of lessons that had shaped who they were today. Not just as parents, but as people who had learned to embrace vulnerability and openness. The last year had been transformative. The custody battle had been a turning point for both of them. It was then that they had realized how important it was to put their own differences aside for the sake of Ethan. But even more than that, they had begun to recognize the depth of their bond, the bond that had once held them together and that, despite everything, was still there. They were no longer fighting against each other. They were fighting together for their son's future, for their own growth, and for their ability to co-parent with kindness and respect. Rachel reflected on the changes. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been one worth taking. There had been bumps along the way, moments of doubt, and instances where she thought they might not make it. But here they were, sitting together in this familiar cafe, no longer stuck in the past, but embracing the future. "I know we're not the same people we were before," Rachel said softly, breaking the silence between them. "But in a way, I think that's a good thing." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think so too. We've both grown, individually. And that's something I never would have imagined in the beginning. After everything, I didn't know if we'd ever get to this point." Rachel smiled, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "We did. And it's because we didn't give up on what mattered. Ethan, yes. But also ourselves. We learned to forgive, to trust again, and to keep moving forward." David squeezed her hand gently. "We did it, Rachel. We really did." As they sat there, the conversation naturally turned toward their next steps. There was still so much they didn't know, but one thing was certain. They were committed to co-parenting in a way that was healthy for everyone involved. Ethan was their priority, and they had learned to put his needs first, no matter what. But more than that, they had learned how to be friends again. Not in the way they had once been romantic partners, but as two people who respected each other deeply and who were united in their goal of raising their son together. It was a new kind of relationship, one based on understanding, trust, and mutual support. Later that day, as they picked up Ethan from school together, the dynamic between them felt comfortable, easy. Ethan was excited, as always, to see both his parents. He had adjusted to the new arrangement, and it was clear that he felt safe and loved. The bond between all three of them was undeniable, and the joy in Ethan's smile when he saw them together was more than enough confirmation that they were doing the right thing. "Guess what, Mom and Dad?" Ethan exclaimed, running up to them. "I got an A on my science project." "That's awesome, buddy," David said, lifting Ethan up into a playful hug. Rachel's heart swelled as she watched them together. There was no tension, no animosity, just love. The kind of love they had always wanted for their son, but now it was reflected in their actions as co-parents. As they drove home together, Ethan excitedly recounted the details of his project, and Rachel and David exchanged amused glances. The road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in a long time, they felt ready for them. They weren't perfect, and their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Rachel and David found themselves sitting in the living room, talking quietly. The house felt peaceful still, yet full of promise. They had come so far, and now they had the opportunity to build something new, something better. Not as a couple, but as individuals who respected each other and had found a way to coexist peacefully for the sake of their son. "I don't know what the future holds," Rachel said softly, her eyes meeting David's. "But I do know that we're doing the best we can. And that's enough for me." David smiled, his eyes warm. "Yeah, me too." They sat in silence for a moment, just soaking in the tranquility of the evening. They weren't the same people who had stood in the courtroom months ago, fighting for custody. They were different now, stronger, wiser, and more capable of handling whatever life threw their way. They had learned that family didn't always look the way you expected, but that didn't make it any less meaningful. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would always be challenges ahead, new milestones, and moments of growth. But Rachel and David had learned the most important lesson of all, that even through the darkest of times, there is always room for healing, forgiveness, and new beginnings. And as they walked this path of co-parenting together, they knew that their family, though unconventional, was as strong as ever. They had found a way to move forward, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?